Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're asking a pretty big question, like, is humanity stuck in some kind of never-ending crisis of values? We've got some fascinating Spanish texts to help us figure this out. Oh, and a historical timeline, too. And maybe, just maybe, a speech that might hold a few
It
clues.
could be like we're time travelers or something, searching through history for some wisdom.
Yeah.
What's really interesting to me is how these sources we've got, they don't just point out the problem, they actually try to offer some solution.
Well, no pressure then. But okay, let's unpack this whole crisis of values thing. It sounds kind of heavy, right?
It is. But here's the thing. You might be surprised to learn that this feeling of being lost, feeling small, even insignificant in this big, crazy world, what's not new. Philosophers have been trying to figure it out for centuries.
You know, that's actually kind of comforting. Like maybe we're not so different from those ancient Greeks debating in the marketplace.
Exactly. And one of the things these texts keep coming back to is this feeling, I guess you could call it insectification, like that sense of being just a tiny ant in a giant colony.
Hmm.
And they link it to materialism, to like stuff. Does that sound
Oh,
familiar?
absolutely. But I'm curious how did they define this crisis back then? Where did they even begin?
Well, even in ancient Greece, you had these big thinkers clashing, like Protagoras. He said, man is the measure of all things. But then you have Plato, and he says, no, 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 God is the measure. It's a pretty fundamental question, right? Like, where does our value come from, our purpose?
It makes you wonder, were they already seeing a shift in values happening even way back then?
It's possible. Think about Socrates. His whole thing was this relentless pursuit of truth, trying to pin down what does it even mean to be human. He even hinted at this idea of immortality. Pretty different from how most of us think today.
Yeah, that's definitely different from someone like Aristotle. He was all about the state, right? The collective good, putting that above the individual.
Right, Aristotle saw us as, well, political animals, meant to live in and contribute to the city-state. But then you have these other thinkers like Antisthenes. He really championed this idea of freedom. And that idea, it really gets to the heart of what it means to be human. And that idea, well, it echoes through history. It even shows up later with Peron. We'll get to that.
Okay, so we've got these ancient philosophers debating the meaning of life, the purpose of humanity. But then Christianity comes along and it kind of throws a wrench in things, right?
Yeah, it does. Christianity, it brought this radical idea. Human unity under a higher power, under God. Think of it like this. Aristotle, he saw humans as focused on the earthly city-state, what you might call horizontal man. But Christianity, it introduces vertical man, someone eternally connected to something bigger.
So it's not just about our place in society anymore, it's our place in the cosmos. That's a huge shift.
Right. And then you have figures like Thomas Aquinas. He was trying to blend this new Christian worldview with the old ideas of Aristotle. He said free will, that's key for morality. But he also saw a role for the state in educating people, guiding them towards virtue.
That's a fascinating tension. So we're already seeing these ideas about individual freedom and the role of the state being debated way back then.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated as we move into the Renaissance. We often think of the Renaissance as this rebirth of humanism, this return to those classic Greek ideals.
But the text, it seems to suggest it also planted the seeds for a whole new kind of crisis. Am I reading that right?
You are. See, the Renaissance also gave rise to scientific inquiry. Think Descartes. I think, therefore I am. It's all about individual reason now, the power of the human mind.
So instead of looking to God for answers, we start looking inward to ourselves.
Yeah. And that leads to this split between theoretical science and what they call practical philosophy. You've got this pursuit of knowledge on one hand and then this search for meaning on the other.
And that tension between the material world and the spiritual, it's still with us today, right? It's like we're
Yeah.
always trying to find that balance where science and spirituality can kind of coexist.
Exactly. And the text, it captures this tension perfectly. It
Yeah.
contrasts Leibniz. He saw virtue as, well, he called it disdain for the perishable. But then at the same time, there's this growing focus on material progress. It's like these two forces are pulling us in opposite directions.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient Greece through the rise of Christianity, through the Renaissance, and this tension between material and spiritual values, well, it seems like it just keeps building.
Oh, it does. And it really explodes in the 18th century. The Enlightenment, you've got Rousseau, he's got this unwavering faith in the individual. And then you've got Hobbes, he had a much bleaker view. He saw humans as, well, inherently selfish and brutal.
Man is a wolf to man, right? Homo homini lupus, not exactly a very optimistic view.
Nope, not at all. And in the middle of all this, you've got Voltaire, he's critiquing the monarchy. And Montesquieu is laying out his ideas for a republic. It's a period of radical change, upheaval. You've got figures like Kant advocating for freedom, equality, individual rights.
It's amazing to see how these ideas we take for granted today, were so revolutionary back then. They literally changed the course of history.
They did. You might even be surprised to learn that this idea of the state as the supreme administrator of happiness, well, that actually came from Grotius during this time. It's a pretty different way of thinking about the role of government than we do today.
Wow, that is surprising. It makes you think maybe our ideas about individualism and the role of the state aren't that different from what these Enlightenment thinkers were wrestling with.
Exactly. And this all sets the stage for the 19th and 20th centuries.
Hmm.
This is where those ideas are going to play out on a global scale. The rise of industrialization, capitalism, all those new political ideologies like Marxism.
It's like we're building on the foundation laid by those earlier philosophers, but we're also facing a whole new set of challenges and complexities.
Right. And as we move into this period, we're going to see how this crisis of values, this enduring crisis, continues to shape our world.
Okay, so buckle up, everyone. We're about to time travel into some of the most turbulent periods in human history.
And along the way, we'll be searching for those little bits of wisdom, those insights that might help us understand, maybe even navigate the challenges of our own time. So here we are on the edge of the 19th and 20th centuries. This is where all those big Enlightenment ideas, the ones we were talking about, they really start to reshape the world.
Yeah, it's a time of massive change, upheaval. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, right? You've got new political ideologies popping up left and right. The whole global landscape is being redrawn.
Exactly. And right in the thick of it, you've got figures like Karl Marx emerging. He comes along with a completely materialist take on history. Class struggle, that's the engine, the driving force behind societies, behind conflict.
So instead of a crisis of values, it's a crisis of economics, or are they connected somehow?
That's the million-dollar question. And let's not forget about Hegel. His big idea, the state as this almost divine entity. Really powerful concept. It influenced thinkers on both the left and the right.
It's interesting how these big kind of abstract philosophical ideas actually end up shaping political movements, ideologies. It shows you that these debates, they can have real world consequences.
Absolutely. But it's not all doom and gloom. Remember Fick?
Yeah.
He kind of offered an alternative. He said the individual, yeah, they might be, subordinated to society, but they're still capable of self-realization.
Oh, so a little glimmer of hope there, some individual agency amidst all these massive historical forces. I like that.
Right. Now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Juan Peron and his 1949 speech in Argentina. Remember the text. It calls for this new equilibrium, a way to balance material progress with those spiritual values.
And we're going to see if Peron's speech kind of echoes that call, right?
Exactly. But to understand his message, we need to understand his world. So let's take a trip back to 1930s Argentina. What does the timeline tell us? Well, political instability, economic hardship, it's all there.
Right. It's the infamous decade, isn't it? Coups, corruption, women are still fighting for basic rights. Doesn't sound like that ideal community the text talks about.
It doesn't. And this is the backdrop against which Peron is rising to power. He's seeing firsthand the failures of traditional leadership, the disillusionment of the people.
And the timeline even mentions that border dispute with Bolivia. It shows his early experience, both military and diplomatic. It's like he's being shaped by these chaotic times.
He is. And remember, all of this is happening as the world is reeling from the global economic crisis. And it hit Argentina pretty hard. The timeline mentions this pact, the Roca-Runciman Treaty, signed between Argentina and Britain.
Right. And that kind of highlights those global power dynamics, doesn't it? Argentina, they had all these resources, but they were forced to accept these unfavorable terms just to stay afloat. It sounds like an early example of that insectification concept we talked about.
Exactly. Argentina's economy, it was dependent, and that limited their autonomy. It contributed to this feeling of, powerlessness.
Oh, yeah.
And this theme of economic hardship, well, it comes up again in the timeline. Remember the painting by Bernie that was rejected? It was called Desocupados, Unemployed.
It's like art imitating life, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe art reflecting the anxieties of the time. It makes you wonder, are those same anxieties still present today, just, in different forms?
Absolutely. Now, fast forward to 1936. The Spanish Civil War breaks out. This conflict, it undoubtedly had a huge impact on Peron's thinking.
He saw firsthand the devastating consequences of ideological extremism, right?
He did. You had fascists against Republicans. It echoes that philosophical debate we talked about.
Yeah.
The role of the state, individual liberty. And remember, Peron traveled through Europe in 1940. He's observing different political systems, even military strategies. This is during World War II. It's a time of global conflict, uncertainty.
Wow, it's like he's absorbing all these different ideologies, all these competing visions for the future. No wonder he emphasizes the need for a new equilibrium later on. I mean, he saw what happens when the old systems break down.
Exactly. And back in Argentina, things are changing fast. You have a military coup in 1943. This leads to Perón becoming the Secretary of Labor and Welfare. This is where he starts putting those social reforms into practice. This is what Peronism is all about.
So he's not just talking about ideas now, he's trying to actually make them happen.
He is. He's fighting for workers' rights, social justice, economic independence. The timeline mentions the creation of a merchant marine fleet. This is a big step. It's about breaking free from those restrictive economic ties.
So fascinating how Perón's personal experiences, they're really shaping his political vision.
They are. Then, 1945 arrives. World War II is over. But now you have a new global conflict brewing, the Cold War.
The world is dividing into these ideological camps. In Argentina, under Perón, they're trying to find their own way.
It's a delicate balancing act. And right in the middle of all this, he meets Yvette Blorte. She becomes his wife, a powerful political figure in her own right.
It's like all these pieces are coming together, like destiny almost.
Right, and in 1946, Perón is elected president of Argentina. The timeline highlights some of the big things he does. Nationalizing the central bank, more rights for workers, pushing for economic self-sufficiency.
He's trying to build that new equilibrium, isn't he?
He is, but it's not easy. The timeline mentions opposition to his policies, even a counter-revolution in 1945.
It reminds you that this search for a better society, well, it's rarely a smooth ride.
Exactly. Okay, so now we're getting close to the year of Perón's speech, 1949. This is when the first National Congress of Philosophy takes place in Mendoza, Argentina. A pretty big deal.
Wow. He's actually bringing philosophers together, creating the space for these huge ideas to be debated, on a national stage.
He is. And remember, this is all happening as the Cold War is intensifying. The timeline even mentions the Soviet Union's first successful atomic bomb test. That happened in 1949.
The stakes are incredibly high, the world is on edge, and here's Perón calling for this new equilibrium. It's a powerful message, and so timely.
It is. So with all of this historical context in mind, let's finally dive into Perón's speech. Let's see what he has to say.
Okay, I'm ready to hear it.
The very first line, it sets the tone. Perón says, "We are living in a transcendental moment." He knows right from the start this is serious. The weight of history is on his shoulders.
Like he's saying, the choices we make now, they're going to determine the future of humanity. No pressure.
Right. And he immediately connects this to that central theme from the text, a deep crisis of values. He's echoing that feeling of disillusionment, remember that nausea towards traditional morality.
So he's not shying away from the problem, he's calling it out.
He is. But he doesn't stop there. He says philosophy, it has a crucial role to play right now. He talks about its pedagogical mission, its ability to illuminate, to reveal.
He's saying we need to think our way out of this mess, use our minds to find solutions.
Exactly. And then he says this, from the elevated spaces where the ultimate reasons shine, comes the norm that articulates the social body and corrects its deviations. Powerful stuff, right?
Wow, that's beautiful. He's connecting that concept of a norm, that guiding principle, to something higher, to a search for truth, something that goes beyond individual opinions or trends.
You got it. He's not talking about just rules or laws. It's a deeper sense of right and wrong, like a moral compass to guide individuals and societies.
And I love how he uses the word articulates. It suggests that this norm, it's not about some rigid structure. It's about connecting things, creating a cohesive whole.
Exactly. Building a bridge between what individuals want and what's good for everyone.
Okay, so Perón is drawing on those philosophical ideas we talked about. But how does he connect them to the specific problems of his time?
He does it through history. He looks back at the Renaissance. He describes how humanity was given this table of values from those Hellenic Greek thinkers, just like Israel from Sinai.
Powerful image, like rediscovering these essential truths. But then he points out how that focus shifted over time. He contrasts Socrates, his quest for self-understanding, with Voltaire's critique of the monarchy.
Yeah, like a change in direction. From seeking wisdom within to challenging those external structures. And Perón takes it even further. He talks about Auguste Comte. Comte basically replaced the worship of God with the worship of humanity.
But that's a big shift. Comte is ushering in a new era focused on material progress, social evolution.
He is. But Perón is also worried about the downsides of this shift. He talks about how the measure of man, well, it started to fade, replaced by technology, social movements.
It's like we lost sight of those cosmic magnitudes, that sense of wonder, that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
And he's worried about what happens when we lose that. He says, man, society, or the state are obliged to invent a new scale of values, a new morality. Like we're lost at sea, searching for a new compass.
So we gained all this material progress, but lost something essential along the way, our purpose, our connection to something bigger.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really crucial point. Peron argues that before we can have true well-being, we have to recognize and value the essences of human beings.
He's saying real progress, it can't just be about material wealth, it has to be about human flourishing.
Yes. And he uses this great metaphor. He says, the man who has to be dignified and put on the path to obtaining his well-being must be, above all, qualified and recognized in his essences.
Okay, that's good. Like, you have to polish the diamond before you can really appreciate its brilliance, right?
Love it. And then Peron makes this interesting observation about virtue. He says, true virtue, it doesn't block progress. It doesn't condemn rebellion, but it does oppose disorder.
So it's not about being passive or complacent. It's about channeling our energy toward a higher purpose.
You got it. It's about finding that balance between individual freedom and what's good for the community. Using our talents, our passions, to build a more just and harmonious society.
Now, this is where Peron gets really passionate. He starts talking about love. He says, love among men would have achieved better fruits in less time than it has cost humanity to sow rancor.
Such a powerful statement, a plea for understanding, compassion in a world that's so often driven by conflict and division.
Right. He's contrasting this with the philosophy of Hobbes, who saw humans as inherently selfish, competitive.
Homo homini lupus again.
Yeah.
Man is a wolf to man. It's a bleak view, but honestly one that still feels relevant today. It does. But Peron rejects this. He calls for a return to the Socratic lights and the evangelical hope of love and compassion.
He even quotes Kant's categorical imperative. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. It's a reminder that every human being has inherent worth and dignity.
Absolutely. And he challenges the Marxist view of history. It's solely driven by class struggle. He knows there are conflicting interests, but he says it's our responsibility to try to gradually diminish them.
So it's about finding common ground, recognizing that we're all human, even when we disagree, which feels super relevant right now.
It does. And this leads Peron to connect the idea of virtue to ethics. He argues that our virtue will not be perfect until it is completed by that ethic, which measures personal values.
So it's about aligning our actions with our principles, right? Trying to be the best versions of ourselves, not just for ourselves, but for the community.
Exactly. He even quotes Herbert Spencer, who said that the ultimate meaning of ethics consists of the correction of egoism.
Again, it's about going beyond our own self-interest, recognizing that true fulfillment comes from contributing to something bigger.
Right. Now, Peron makes this fascinating point about the impact of industrialization and capitalism. He says, these forces, they've shifted our focus. We've gone from this individual fortress unity to a more interconnected social understanding of ourselves.
So we've gone from isolated castles to bustling cities. The way we see ourselves, our role in the world, it's fundamentally changed.
It has. But Peron also warns about the dangers of unchecked individualism. He says true freedom, it's not just about doing whatever you want. It's about making choices, informed choices, based on a deep understanding of our values, our responsibilities.
He emphasizes the importance of cultural action and self-awareness, like essential ingredients for meaningful freedom. It's like freedom without responsibility, it's just chaos.
Exactly. And then he makes this bold statement. He says, class struggle, as such, is in the process of being overcome. He thinks there's a better way, a path toward social harmony, cooperation.
But he's not naive, is he? He acknowledges the challenges, what does he call them? The vestiges of violently induced motives.
Right, they're still there. But he's calling for a new kind of social evolution, one based on dignifying humanity, recognizing our shared destiny. It's about moving beyond those old divisions, that us versus them mentality that's been around for centuries.
Okay, so Peron is advocating for this middle path, a balance between individual freedom and what the community needs. But how do we actually do that? It sounds pretty idealistic.
He says true progress, it has to be rooted in the individual's own hierarchy, attentive to his own goals and aware of his participation in the general. It's about each of us finding our place in the big picture.
It's about understanding that we're all connected, Our actions, they have ripple effects. They go way beyond ourselves.
And this leads to Peron's idea of redemption through elevation, achieved through living together in community. It's about striving for something higher, using our talents, our passions, to contribute to something bigger than ourselves.
He even says that humanity is a crucible of dignity and an atmosphere of freedom.
What a beautiful image. It suggests that we can shape our own destinies, create a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, to reach their full potential.
But it takes effort, right? Intention,
Yeah.
and a real commitment to those core values.
It does. And Peron warns us about prioritizing material progress over spiritual values.
He mentions Kaiserling, right? Who said that the 18th and 19th centuries, they kind of neglected the soul in their pursuit of progress. A critique that feels very relevant today as we're grappling with consumerism, technology, the erosion of real human connection.
It is. Peron even quotes Victor Hugo, who eloquently defended the importance of the infinite and the ideal. We need more than just stuff. We need something to aspire to, something to believe in.
I think so many people feel that emptiness today. We have all these things, but are we happy? Are we living meaningful lives?
It's the question, isn't it? And Peron points out the danger of a society that just reduces people to cogs in a machine, denying their inherent dignity and freedom.
It's a warning against those dehumanizing forces that can take root anywhere, in any society, no matter what the political ideology.
And that brings us back to that term, nausea, that sense of disillusionment, emptiness. When we lose sight of those core values, that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
It's like that feeling you get when you eat too much junk food. Yeah, you're full, but you're not actually nourished.
Perfect analogy. And he connects this nausea to the loss of the scale of magnitudes. We can't see ourselves in relation to the universe, to the complexity of human experience.
Like we're so focused on our own little bubbles, we've forgotten how to look up at the stars.
And this brings us back to that term, the insectification of the individual. Peron uses that fable of Melusina to illustrate this point.
The story of the guy who chooses wealth over his own, well, stature, over meaning, purpose.
Right, he's saying we can lose ourselves chasing material progress. We can become so fixated on getting things that we forget what it means to truly live.
And he talks about those two flawed societal responses, right? Amoral individualism and depersonalizing collectivism.
Exactly. Both extremes are destructive. They lead to alienation, conflict, a loss of human dignity.
So what's the alternative? How do we find that new equilibrium?
Peron says we need a norm, that guiding principle that can help us navigate all of this. But remember, it's not something imposed on us.
Right. It's not about blindly following the rules or
Yeah.
conforming to what society expects. It's something we each discover on our own through self-reflection, understanding.
Exactly. He says culture and education, they're super important for cultivating this norm. We need spaces where people can wrestle with these big questions, where they can develop their own moral compass and contribute to the collective good.
So it's not just about changing laws or systems, it's about changing hearts and minds.
Precisely. And Peron's vision, it's a world where freedom and responsibility go together, where justice prevails, where everyone has the chance to experience, what does he call it, spiritual euphoria, to find meaning in their lives. It's a beautiful vision.
It is, and I think it's a vision worth striving for, even if the path there is difficult, complicated.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we're left with a lot to think about.
Yeah.
How do Peron's ideas resonate with us today? Are we still facing this crisis of values? And if we are, what can we do as individuals, as a community, to find that new equilibrium?
These are some big questions to chew on, and I think we'll be exploring them in the final part of this deep dive.
We will. Stay tuned. So we were talking about that feeling, that nausea, remember, that emptiness, that disillusionment. It happens when we lose sight of what really matters, those core values, when we lose that connection to something, well, something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, like we're just adrift, lost in a sea of, stuff.
Yeah.
Chasing fleeting desires.
Exactly. And he brings up that fable again, Melusina. Remember, the man who chooses wealth over his own stature, his sense of meaning, his purpose.
Yeah, a reminder that chasing more, it doesn't always lead to fulfillment. Sometimes it just leaves you feeling empty.
Right. And then he talks about those two ways that societies try to respond to this crisis. But they're both flawed. A moral individualism and then depersonalizing collectivism.
So on the one hand, you've got people just retreating into themselves, just looking out for number one, not caring about anyone else.
And on the other hand, the individual gets completely swallowed up by the collective. They lose their own identity, their own worth.
Both extremes sound, well, pretty bad. Do you see these things happening today, like in our society?
Oh, absolutely. Think about social media, for example. The pressure to, create the perfect online persona, it can be a breeding ground for both narcissism and conformity.
It's like we're constantly being pulled in two directions. We want to stand out, but we also want to fit in. It's exhausting.
It is. And it makes it really hard to find that balance, that sweet spot
Hmm.
between expressing yourself and being responsible, to the community.
So how do we navigate that? What does Peron say?
He keeps coming back to this idea of a norm, a guiding principle, something to help us make sense of all this. But it's not something that someone else just hands to us.
Right. It's not about following rules blindly or just doing what everyone else does. It's something we have to figure out for ourselves.
Exactly. And he says culture, education, they're key to cultivating this norm. We need spaces where people can actually grapple with these big questions, where they can develop their own moral compass and figure out how to contribute to something larger.
It's like he's calling for I don't know, a cultural revolution almost. A shift in our values, our priorities.
He is. His vision, it's a world where freedom and responsibility go together, where there's justice, where everyone has a chance to experience that, spiritual euphoria,
Yeah.
and to find meaning in their lives.
It's a beautiful vision, but how do we actually get there? Where do we even start?
Peron says it starts with recognizing that every human being has dignity, has worth.
Sounds like a pretty good place to start.
It is, and he encourages us to cultivate this sense of shared purpose, to work together, to build a society that values both individual flourishing and the common good.
So it's not about choosing sides, is it? It's not about individualism versus collectivism. It's about finding a way to integrate both, to create a society that honors the individual and the community.
That's it. That's the key takeaway from Peron's speech and really from this whole deep dive.
We've traveled through, what, centuries of philosophy. We explored a really complex historical period, and it all comes back to this basic question. What does it mean to be human?
And how do we build a world that allows everyone to reach their full potential while also contributing to something bigger?
That's a big one, and I think it's a question each of us has to wrestle with, on our own.
Yeah, it's an ongoing journey
Yeah.
for each of us individually and for us as a community.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought. If this norm that Peron talks about, if it's not something that's forced on us, but something we discover, well, what are those things in your own life, your own values, that could help build a better community, a world where everyone has the chance to thrive?
The journey doesn't stop here.
Mm-hmm.
It's up to each of us to keep exploring these ideas, to find our own answers, and then to get out there and help build that world.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.